What's going on, YouTube? Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Texas Street Stories, where we talk about what happens on these Texas streets. And if you haven't already subscribed, help your boy out and hit the subscribe button. On today's episode, we're going to continue reading The Unmaking of a Criminal Mind by Robert Delgado. The Insane Asylum, winter of 1980. The unlicensed Jack Kerouacans and their long white coats came like thieves, using force to steal my treasured IQ and those threaded memories in my criminal mind that they so much feared. I knew too much, like who they murdered and why or who. For half a decade, I had helped them load 18-wheelers of state trucks with tons of stolen beef, cattle, machinery. Whatever wasn't bolted down to the building was stolen. I couldn't tell if the criminals wore gray or white. The uniform was just that, a uniform. I was cuffed to a gurney and by ambulance transferred from the East Ham unit to the so-called treatment center in Huntsville. I was stripped naked and thrown into a strip cell. It snowed that year. The only warmth came from prayer. I didn't believe in Christ, so why did I pray? Because it was instilled in me as a child. Prayer was a natural response when I found myself in trouble. I was force-fed hallucinate, mind-altering experimental poisons by unlicensed psychologists. To justify the injections and white peanuts, they labeled me a hostile patient. Excuse me, hostile they made me. I'm like a obedient dog to be passive toward their gangsters. In the semi-darkness of my cage, goblin shadows danced off the walls as my eyes fogged up. I shook my head toward off the madness and visions the poisoners brought with them. I'm not an informant, so if questioned, I don't remember or don't want to remember. So there are no witnesses to the thefts. The only evidence of who was murdered lies beneath some old tombstones that is safely locked away in the corner of my mind. A dark secret that will go to the grave with. So don't worry, guys. I won't tell. I won't tell wasn't good enough. The place was a scene from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, but that was a movie with actors. This was as real as it gets, and these characters were not actors, but the real enchilada. Like the rest of them here, I was now part of it. Gandhi told me as he handed me a fully loaded food tray. And this is Cantiflas, he added, looking at his sidekick that was looking aggressively at a fly that was violating the no-fly zone above the food cart, as if he was about to snatch it in mid-flight. Jesus had a name, and it wasn't Jesus, but Juan Lopez, by the name tag on his wrist. The program was one of the surest and less viable means the administration had for dealing with those bucking the system. A means for making you crazy and submissive, and a sure way for erasing memories from minds as easily as erasing chalk from a blackboard. But I beat them at their own game by hiding my treasures deeper in a corner of my mind where they could not be reached and erased. Now I question myself, did I beat them at their game? I'm not so sure now. I often wonder if the poisons I often wonder if the poisons didn't addict me to the other drugs to help me cope with the anxieties of the free life, or if their tempering with my mind didn't mold the criminal mind. The prison officials had it all worked out, where if investigated by outside sources about their criminal activities, including the mysterious deaths of healthy prisoners, they could point a finger at us, the eyewitnesses, and answer, look at them, they're crazy. Their stories are hallucinations of their criminal minds. Excuse me? Former prison wardens Christian and Tara were lucky to not have been my cellmates at the treatment center. The TDC administration, after firing them for reporting extensive high level of administration corruption, went on a smear campaign to discredit the warden stories by labeling the wardens before the media as nuts, kooks, and crazy, when only days before the wardens had been labeled by the same people as TDC's finest. But now, because the wardens were exposing internal corruption, they were nuts. I survived the 2 months at the treatment center by playing the role of a submissive zombie. I was transferred back to the East Ham unit. Everybody at the East Ham was older than me, and most of them were heavily tattooed. It wouldn't be long before I was walking around as tattooed as the others, just as scars served as reminders of an enemy or an unpleasant past event. The more ink on the prisoner's flesh, the more reminders he seemed to have to specific places and people. The TS patch tattooed years earlier to my left forearm was also a reminder to not to me, but to others to steer clear from my path. 5 days after returning from the treatment center, or the Asylum cellar, as others called it, I was back in solitary. This time for breaking the arm of a building tender by planting the blade of my Aggie into his elbow. Nothing could change me, not the mind-altering poisons, not solitary, not the beatings, not nothing. It was then that the most powerful man in the house gave me an execution date with his angels of death, the building tenders. The author of this 1980 murderous plot, who added my name to the building tenders hit list, was the building major. Another routine murder was to take place, or so they thought. A building tender co-conspirator to the murder conspiracy risked his life to betray the plot. Then on one of those great mysteries of life happened. The building major was put to sleep by an act of God that I cannot explain. The unexpected murder of the building major while he was sipping coffee in his office voided the murder contract that he had placed over my head. In 1981, as the cell doors were about to be rolled open, there was a special news broadcast on the radio announcing that President Ronald Reagan had been shot. I stepped out of my cell, and further down the catwalk, so did TS member Burrell. A year earlier, Burrell had murdered another prisoner. Burrell was one of only 3 Anglo men allowed to join the gang. They had proved their worth in gold by killing for the gang. As we entered the main corridor, we spontaneously pulled out from our pockets our shanks and started tying them to our right hands with boot strings, as insurance that during the stabbing, our shanks wouldn't be knocked loose from our hands. In an act of violence that rarely takes over 10 seconds, we stabbed the building tender. The veteran building tenders knew they were witnessing the TS second helping at the butcher's table and did nothing to help the green building tender as we stabbed him. You see, when a Texas Syndicate member murdered a prisoner in the KKK cell block, the building tenders had beat him down, and now it was the Texas Syndicate to turn to fulfill its vow to treat 2 building tenders in like manner. In an earlier stabbing, that had only fulfilled half of the Texas Syndicate vow. This stabbing would make the vow complete. Silently, the building tenders had resolved to do nothing but watch their comrade get stabbed. The fear of retaliation was taking hold. The message had finally made itself clear. Kill, stab, or beat a Texas Syndicate member, and your slab of meat will be next on the butcher's table. After receiving the customary beating by guards after the stabbing, I was thrown in solitary and then transferred to Ramsey 1 unit, that is also known as the Rockin' Ram. And boy, was it rocking in narcotics, violence, and corruption. Every officer from the warden, major, to low-level guards were on the take. By the end of 1981, the bottled-up fury of frustration that the Texas Syndicate had violently unleashed upon the building tenders had worn them down. A silent agreement of peace with the Texas Syndicate was made, a sort of we'll leave you alone if you leave us alone type of peace. The 3,000 man building tender army had conceded for the first time in its long history to power sharing with a small force of men that did not suppress the 100 men mark. That was the biggest sham of the building tender and the Texas Syndicate conflict. That the building tenders in their paranoid minds had wrongfully concluded that the TS had over 1,000 members. The truth was that was what really 100 members they refused to believe. The building tenders had fallen for their own deception. The building tenders' boldness had quickly become a thing of the past. We had earned our respect and placed at the devil's table by the use of sheer force, the one and only thing that a mule understands and respects. The building tenders had drawn the line, a fine line. Anybody in white or gray and anything not claimed by the TS was fair game. With the building tenders backed up against a corner, it was time to move forward towards the future, or as someone would say, move on to second base. Power sharing was a sign of weakness that we would take advantage of. The lucrative prison black market was now a free enterprise for the Texas Syndicate to exploit, having muscled itself into place. The Texas Syndicate will now police the devil's playground. Before turning to crime, and my ambitions as a youth were to become a cop. But now, as an adult and chairman of the Texas Syndicate, I had become more than a cop. I was now the police chief of Batman Gotham City. The Texas Syndicate was running a safe city that was bustling with activities both day and night. A city that did not sleep. Almost every cell within a cell block represented some sort of business. A gambling casino, a laundromat, a tattoo shop, a weapons dealer, a cafe, a loan company, a liquor store, a brothel, a dope house, a law office, and much more. Wherever there was a dollar to be made, the Texas Syndicate was sure to have a hand in it. You could purchase everything, including good time, towards your prison sentence to shorten your time in prison. If a prisoner or guard wanted something that the Texas Syndicate didn't have in stock, we would simply order it from the state of Texas warehouse and bill the taxpayers. The Texas Syndicate, reaping a 10% tax from other prisoners in cash, narcotics, or convict currency, coffee. It was the price of being allowed to do business. 10% was not much, but once we added up all the 10% going down daily, it was a pretty profit. Besides, in prison, life is cheap. Then, to prevent fresh human meat coming off the prison chain bus from falling prey to the predators of flesh, we started placing many of them under our gang's protection. This angered many of the building tenders who were used to raping and extorting the weaker class of prisoners. The building tenders resented all of this, but for now, they stood back with hatred burning behind their smiling faces, understanding that for the moment, it was better to do with much less than to risk losing their lives. The Texas Syndicate was to learn a valuable lesson, that it organized that can be relatively easy to seize power, but to maintain power, it would prove difficult.